The morning started like any other, with me sipping coffee on my grandmother's century-old porch swing, watching the sky blush pink as the sun stretched across the horizon. The air carried the soft scent of blooming roses, their wild beauty a direct contrast to the cold uniformity of the houses that had slowly taken over the neighborhood. My home, a grand Victorian masterpiece passed down for 3 generations, stood proudly among them, a relic of history in a sea of beige conformity. I ran my fingers along the wooden armrest of the swing, its paint slightly worn from years of gentle use, and smiled as the familiar creak of the chains accompanied the rustling leaves. The peaceful moment was shattered when I spotted her. Karen Thompson, the self-appointed queen of the newly formed HOA, power-walking toward my mailbox with the same smug determination she wore at every neighborhood meeting. In her manicured hands, she clutched an envelope as though it were a proclamation of absolute authority. I felt my stomach tighten. I knew what was coming. I had seen that glint in her eyes before, during the first meeting she hosted in her renovated McMansion, where she had made it clear that my historic home was an eyesore that needed modernization. She didn't believe in charm or character, she believed in property values and control. Karen lingered at my mailbox longer than necessary, snapping photos of my front yard, no doubt gathering ammunition for whatever battle she was planning next. My grandmother's roses, lush, fragrant, and unapologetically wild, must have been an absolute offense to her sensibilities. I could practically hear her gritting her teeth at the sight of their unruly petals spilling over the garden edge. The moment she turned on her heel and strutted back toward her house, phone pressed to her ear, I retrieved the envelope with a sense of unease. The thick paper and glossy brochure inside confirmed my suspicions. An invitation, if you could call it that, to officially join the HOA. The fee: $5,000 up front, plus $350 in monthly dues. That alone was enough to make my hands shake with irritation, but what truly set my blood boiling was the attached list of mandatory property modifications. The vibrant purple trim that framed my home, the same shade my grandmother had painted with loving hands decades ago, had to be removed. My cherished rose garden, which had thrived for generations, needed to be replaced with approved vegetation. And the antique wind chimes that had sung me to sleep since childhood? Gone. Non-compliant structures, the letter read in a crisp, detached tone, must be removed to maintain neighborhood aesthetics. I glanced out the window and saw Karen standing on her front porch, her lips stretched into that saccharine, condescending smile. She was still on the phone, but her voice carried easily across the street. "Yes, I just delivered the final invitation," she said, turning her gaze toward my house. "She has to join now. Her property is the last holdout on the street." That evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, casting long shadows over the pavement, I made my way to Karen's house, invitation in hand. Her doorbell chimed a triumphant, instrumental version of "We Are the Champions." Of course, it did. She answered in record time, wearing a crisp neighborhood watch captain badge pinned to her perfectly pressed cardigan. "Good evening," she beamed, as if she hadn't just spent the day scheming. "I assume you've reviewed our invitation?" I held up the envelope but didn't step inside. "I have," I said, keeping my voice even. "And I need to decline. This house has been in my family for 3 generations. It's a piece of history, and I intend to preserve it." The smile flickered from her face like a candle in the wind. "Oh," she said, the single syllable laced with poorly concealed irritation. "I don't think you understand." She stepped forward, lowering her voice, her sugary tone vanishing. "This isn't really an invitation. The HOA has already been registered, and your property is surrounded by HOA members. You have to join." My grip on the envelope tightened. "Actually," I countered, pulling out the property maps I had researched that afternoon, "that's incorrect. My deed predates any HOA agreements, and I have no legal obligation to join. 20 years of legal experience had taught me to always do my homework." Karen's face flushed red, the delicate shade of an overpriced Merlot. "Listen here," she hissed, her nails digging into the doorframe. "This neighborhood is changing. Progress is happening. If you don't get with the program, things might get difficult." She let the words linger, her eyes narrowing. "Accidents happen to houses that don't meet code. Citations add up. Fines pile on. Unsafe structures get condemned." I met her gaze steadily. "Is that a threat, Mrs. Thompson?" Her lips twitched before curling into that fake, practiced smile. "Of course not," she purred. "I'm just concerned about your property values. And safety, of course. Old houses like yours can be so unpredictable. Electrical issues. Structural problems. It would be terrible if something happened just because you refused to modernize." Behind her, I noticed her husband, Bob, standing by the window, phone in hand. His stance was too stiff, too focused. He was listening. Recording, maybe. I nodded politely and turned to leave, but Karen's voice followed me like a specter. "1 week," she called after me. "You have 1 week to reconsider before the HOA board meets to discuss enforcement options." As I walked back to my house, I could feel eyes on me. New faces watched from behind curtains and porch railings, Karen's allies, no doubt. A chill crept up my spine. Something told me this wasn't going to end with a simple declined invitation. That night, I installed security cameras around my property, ensuring they covered every inch of my land. I documented my house's current condition, took detailed photos of my garden, my fence, my electrical box. I had learned long ago to trust my instincts, and right now, they were screaming that Karen Thompson wasn't just playing a game. She was launching a full-scale war. What I didn't know then was that this wasn't just about property values or purple trim. In my 3 decades of dealing with difficult people, I had never encountered someone like Karen. She wasn't just persistent, she was methodical, calculating. And she had an entire board of like-minded followers backing her every move. As I lay in bed that night, the familiar sound of my grandmother's wind chimes lulling me into a restless sleep, I had no idea that this was only the beginning. That my beloved home, the last remaining piece of my family's legacy, was about to become the first casualty in a battle that would change everything. And that Karen had made one crucial mistake in choosing me as her target. Because unlike the homeowners she had bullied before, I wasn't just some stubborn old resident clinging to the past. I was a federal judge. And I had the power to destroy everything she had built. She just didn't know it yet. The following morning, I woke to an email from the county zoning board. The subject line alone sent a surge of irritation through me. Urgent, property code violations, immediate attention required. Clicking it open, I found a list of supposed infractions, each more absurd than the last. Unapproved exterior paint colors. Unauthorized garden structures. Excessive vegetation obstructing neighborhood uniformity. I exhaled slowly, rubbing my temples. The timestamps showed the complaints had been filed at 6:32 a.m., less than an hour ago. Karen Thompson wasted no time. I closed my laptop and glanced out the window. Across the street, she stood at the end of her driveway, coffee cup in hand, watching. She didn't wave, didn't smile. Just waited. She wanted a reaction. I refused to give her one. Instead, I grabbed my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. When the gruff voice answered, I skipped the pleasantries. "Hey, Sam. Need a favor. Remember how you always wanted to take down a corrupt HOA?" There was a pause before a low chuckle rumbled through the speaker. "Now that's a hell of a way to start my morning. I'm listening." By the afternoon, Sam had already pulled county records. The HOA had been formed under questionable circumstances, rushed paperwork, missing signatures, a few conveniently placed oversights. The board had filed amendments granting themselves sweeping enforcement powers beyond what was legally allowed. But the real bombshell? The property values in the neighborhood had not increased under the HOA's rule. In fact, they had steadily declined, thanks to a series of forced renovations that left homeowners drowning in debt. Karen wasn't running a neighborhood improvement initiative. She was running a racket. Sam, a former prosecutor with a personal vendetta against HOAs, was practically giddy. "Oh, this is going to be fun," he said, already making calls. "This is extortion, property fraud, zoning manipulation. Hell, we might even be looking at financial abuse of homeowners." I leaned back in my chair, feeling the first genuine sense of control since this ordeal had begun. "I'm not just looking to stop them," I said. "I want them dismantled." Sam let out a low whistle. "You really don't mess around." "Not when someone threatens my home," I replied. "Let's see how Karen likes being on the other side of the law." That night, I received another letter, this time slid under my door. No envelope. No formalities. Just a single sheet of paper with typed words in a bold, ominous font. Last warning. Leave or comply. A lesser person might have felt fear. But fear was a luxury I had discarded a long time ago, in courtrooms filled with criminals who had tried far worse threats than a passive-aggressive neighborhood tyrant. Still, I wasn't foolish enough to underestimate Karen. This wasn't just about some petty power struggle anymore. She had crossed the line from nuisance to criminal conspiracy. And now I had proof. I installed additional security that night. Motion sensors, perimeter alarms. Not because I was scared, but because I wanted to catch them in the act. They were growing desperate. Desperation made people reckless. And reckless people made mistakes. 2 nights later, the mistake came. At exactly 2:17 a.m., my phone buzzed with an alert. Motion detected. Front yard. I slid out of bed and checked the camera feed. 2 figures, dressed in dark clothing, crouched near my garden, one holding a can of spray paint, the other a pair of garden shears. I zoomed in. Bob Thompson. And another board member. Caught red-handed. Smiling, I picked up my phone and dialed the non-emergency police line. "I'd like to report vandalism in progress at my property," I said calmly. "Oh, and just so you know, I have live footage and high-definition images of the perpetrators." 10 minutes later, red and blue lights painted the street as officers confronted the would-be vandals. Karen came running, robe flapping, voice shrill. "There must be some misunderstanding," she cried. "They were just doing routine inspections." The officer turned to me. "Would you like to press charges?" I didn't hesitate. "Absolutely." Karen paled. Bob stammered excuses. But it was too late. The war had officially begun. And I was going to win. My security cameras had captured more than just the arsonists who set my home ablaze that night. As I pored over the footage, I discovered something far more sinister. Weekly meetings held at Karen's house, attended by real estate developers, city officials, and HOA board members. They weren't just small gatherings. These were high-stakes strategy sessions, complete with blueprints, zoning maps, and whispered conversations about million-dollar deals. One developer, a smug man in a tailored suit, casually mentioned that they had bribed city officials to change zoning laws, ensuring that, once enough historic properties had been acquired, there would be no legal obstacles standing in the way of their luxury condo development. Another chuckled as he flipped through a dossier of targeted homes, noting how the owners had been encouraged to leave through relentless HOA fines, intimidation, and even well-timed accidents. And then there was Karen, smiling, sipping her overpriced latte, and orchestrating it all. She had a system, a pattern she followed like clockwork: target homes in prime locations, particularly historic properties that couldn't easily be replicated, weaponize the HOA to harass the owners with citations and fines, then escalate to vandalism and threats if they resisted. If that didn't work, things took a darker turn: gas leaks, electrical fires, structural damage that mysteriously appeared overnight. Once the owners were sufficiently broken and desperate, her group would swoop in, offering them a way out by purchasing the properties for a fraction of their worth. The more I dug, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't Karen's first time running this scheme. Old county records revealed that she had done this before, not once, not twice, but in 3 other historic neighborhoods across nearby counties. The pattern was identical. She would move in, establish an HOA under the guise of preserving property values, then systematically drive out any homeowners who resisted her control. When the dust settled, she and her developer friends would consolidate the properties and sell them for millions, all while receiving awards for community revitalization. She had even been featured in local newspapers as a champion of neighborhood improvement, smiling in front of newly built townhomes that stood where century-old houses once did. But this time, she had made a mistake. She had picked the wrong house, the wrong homeowner. Because, unlike her previous victims, I wasn't just some helpless resident with no recourse. I had access to resources she couldn't anticipate. I spent months gathering every piece of evidence I could find: financial transactions, emails, surveillance footage, and even complaints from former homeowners who had been forced out. But I needed more. To bring her down, I needed irrefutable proof, something that would make any possible defense crumble. That's when I convinced the FBI to wire up the former HOA treasurer, a woman who had once been Karen's closest ally but had been cast aside when she started questioning the financial discrepancies. The meeting was set at Karen's house, just like the ones I had seen on my security footage. As the treasurer walked in, her nerves evident even through the hidden wire, Karen greeted her with her usual condescending smile and a fresh cup of coffee. They exchanged pleasantries before getting down to business, and then it happened. Karen, in her arrogance, admitted to everything. She boasted about their next targets, joked about which houses might have electrical problems, and, in a chilling moment, warned the treasurer that if she ever thought about exposing them, she would disappear. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the smoking gun I had been waiting for. While Karen paraded around the neighborhood, still reveling in her perceived invincibility, I was methodically building the case that would dismantle everything she had worked for. Every smug wave, every fake sympathetic comment about my tragic accident, was another nail in her coffin. And then, in a stroke of luck, I uncovered why she had been so desperate to force me out. Hidden deep within the city archives, buried beneath decades of paperwork, was a map detailing a planned highway expansion. It turned out Karen's developer friends had insider information. My property was the keystone to their multi-million-dollar project. They had already bought up the surrounding land through a series of shell companies, but without my home, the entire development would fall apart. That was why she had pushed so hard, why she had resorted to arson when everything else failed. My burned-out house wasn't just an eyesore to her, it was an obstacle, one that had to be removed at any cost. As I finalized my evidence for the FBI, Karen's desperation became more apparent. She filed daily complaints about my property, insisting that it was a blight on the neighborhood and demanding immediate action. She even proposed a special HOA assessment to fund the cleanup, which, of course, would funnel directly into her pockets. It was almost laughable, her greed, her arrogance, her belief that she was untouchable. Little did she know, every move she made only added more weight to the case against her. The night of the final HOA meeting, the air was thick with tension. I stood outside the community center, heart pounding, watching Karen stride through the entrance with her usual confidence, a stack of papers in one hand and her signature coffee mug in the other. Through the window, I saw her setting up her PowerPoint presentation, no doubt filled with fabricated violations and manipulative rhetoric designed to pressure homeowners into compliance. But tonight would be different. After 6 months of painstaking preparation, of quietly gathering intelligence and laying the groundwork, I was ready to expose everything. My hands trembled slightly as I adjusted the weight of the FBI wire beneath my blazer, ensuring everything was in place. The moment had to be perfect. I pushed open the door just as Karen's voice rang through the room. "The property at 247 Maple Street has been declared a public nuisance," she announced, her tone dripping with false authority. "As per our emergency powers, we will be moving forward with immediate redevelopment plans." A murmur of unease spread through the audience. My neighbors, many of whom had suffered under Karen's iron rule but had been too afraid to challenge her, shifted uncomfortably in their plastic chairs. "Any objections?" she asked, scanning the room with a smirk. Silence. No one dared to speak up. That's when I stepped forward. "I object, Mrs. Thompson." My voice cut through the tension like a blade. Every head turned toward the entrance as I walked slowly down the aisle, my heels clicking against the linoleum floor. Karen's smirk faltered for a split second before she regained her composure. "Well, well," she said, eyes gleaming with feigned amusement. "Come to finally admit defeat? Your burned-out wreck of a house is quite the eyesore. We're doing you a favor, really." She took a slow, deliberate sip from her coffee mug, the same smug smile she had worn the night my house burned. I didn't react. Instead, I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Actually," I said, my voice steady, "I'm here to present some evidence of my own." I stepped forward, laying the contents of my folder across the table for everyone to see. The room fell into a stunned silence as I spread out photograph after photograph, grainy yet damning images captured by my security cameras. "These," I said, voice steady, "show you and your board members trespassing on my property the night of the fire." A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. Karen's eyes flickered to the images, then back to me, her smile tightening. "Those could be anyone," she scoffed, but I saw the flicker of panic behind her eyes. "And besides, you can't prove—" "Oh, but I can." I cut her off, pulling out another set of documents, bank records, email correspondences, text messages. "Here are financial records linking your shell companies to payouts after every distressed property sale. Here are emails discussing your plans to force out non-HOA members. And here," I pulled out the final document with deliberate care. Here are text messages, sent from your phone, detailing how to make sure the electrical fire at my house looked accidental. Gasps erupted around the room. Karen's hands trembled, her coffee mug tipping slightly, the liquid sloshing over the rim. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, voice shrill. "You can't just walk in here with these wild accusations. I'll sue you for defamation." That was my cue. Slowly, methodically, I reached into my briefcase once more, and this time I pulled out my judicial robes. The silk fabric unfurled as I slipped them on, the weight of them settling over my shoulders like a final judgment. The room hushed. Karen's face drained of all color. "Federal Judge Sarah Martinez," I announced, letting the title sink in. "Currently presiding over case number 2025 County Route 142, United States versus Thompson et al. A RICO investigation into corruption, fraud, and criminal conspiracy." A beat of silence. Then, Karen's coffee mug slipped from her fingers, shattering against the floor. The hot liquid splashed across her designer heels, but she didn't even seem to notice. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "FBI," I said smoothly, right on cue. The doors burst open as agents stormed in, badges flashing. Karen's husband, the retired police sergeant who had buried countless reports and shielded her crimes, bolted for the emergency exit. He didn't make it 3 steps before an agent tackled him to the ground. Karen collapsed into her precious president's chair, her body slack with shock. I walked up to her slowly, deliberately, and picked up the wooden gavel she had used to seal the fate of so many homeowners. Turning it over in my hand, I met her wide, frantic eyes. "You know what the biggest mistake criminals make?" I asked softly. "They get so caught up in their own power, they forget to check who they're really dealing with." I let the words hang in the air before bringing the gavel down with a sharp, final thud. Meeting adjourned. The room erupted in applause as the FBI led Karen and her board members away, their hands cuffed behind their backs. Neighbors, people who had lived in fear for years, stood, cheering, clapping, some even crying. Years of intimidation and corruption had just been shattered in a single night. Mrs. Johnson, the elderly woman who had lived across the street from me for decades, pulled me into a tearful hug. "We should have helped you fight them," she whispered, her voice thick with regret. I squeezed her hand. "Sometimes," I murmured, watching Karen being loaded into a waiting police car, "justice takes the long road to make sure it arrives at the right destination." The media storm that followed was relentless. My house fire had been a tragedy, but the conspiracy behind it? That was a national headline. News crews lined the courthouse steps, broadcasting every detail as more victims came forward, as more neighborhoods revealed their own horror stories of HOA corruption and forced displacement. The trial itself was a spectacle. When Karen entered the courtroom for the first time, dressed in an expensive navy suit rather than her usual yoga pants and tennis shoes, her face was ghostly pale. The moment her eyes landed on me, now seated at the bench, wearing my judge's robes, her entire body stiffened. I saw her grab her lawyer's arm, whispering frantically, "That's her. The one whose house we burned." Her lawyer, who up until that moment had seemed perfectly confident in his ability to get her off with a slap on the wrist, visibly paled. The evidence we presented was damning. More than damning, it was overwhelming. Over the weeks, we laid it all out for the jury. Security footage of Karen and her HOA cronies trespassing onto my property, forensic analysis confirming the accelerants used in the fire, financial records tracing bribes to city officials and illegal property transfers to shell companies. But the real turning point came when Karen's own husband, the retired police sergeant who had spent years protecting her secrets, broke. Under pressure from mounting evidence and the threat of a lengthy prison sentence, he flipped. He told the court everything: how they picked their targets, how they manipulated homeowners, how they orchestrated harassment campaigns and, when all else failed, turned to arson. Karen, seated at the defense table, went wild. She screamed, "Liar!" at him so loudly that the bailiffs had to physically restrain her. The jury watched in stunned silence as the walls of her carefully constructed empire collapsed around her. One by one, victims stood up to tell their stories. Mrs. Rodriguez, the retired teacher who had lost decades of family photos in a mysterious house fire. The Patel family, whose grandfather's ashes had been destroyed when their home burned down after refusing to sell. Each testimony chipped away at Karen's last shred of composure, until all that remained was a hollow, broken shell of the woman who had once terrorized an entire community. When the verdict was read, my voice didn't waver. Guilty. The sentencing was swift: 25 years for Karen, 15 for each of her board members. Her husband, having turned state's witness, received a reduced sentence but would still spend years behind bars. As the gavel fell for the final time, Karen tried one last desperate attempt to reclaim control. She stood, voice trembling, trying to justify her actions. "I was just trying to protect property values," she insisted, her voice a fraction of the commanding presence it had once been. I cut her off the same way she had cut off every homeowner who had tried to plead their case before her. "Sit down, Mrs. Thompson." The courtroom was silent. Karen obeyed. 6 months later, I stood in my newly rebuilt rose garden, the scent of fresh blossoms filling the air. The construction on my house was complete. The Victorian trim painted the same perfect shade of purple my grandmother had loved. Where Karen's house once stood, a new family had moved in, an immigrant couple with 3 young children who played in the yard, laughing freely where Karen once stood with her clipboard, photographing violations. The community had changed, but for the better. We had formed a real neighborhood association, not an HOA, not a weaponized bureaucracy, but a group that truly looked out for each other. Last night, we had a block party in my garden. Mrs. Rodriguez brought her famous empanadas. The Patels hosted the monthly meeting in their backyard, their home fully restored. As I sipped my coffee that morning, I glanced at my desk, where a single relic of the past remained: Karen's coffee mug, the one she had dropped in shock.